There's a lot of races in the Legend of Zelda series, and it can get a little confusing trying to figure out what exactly happened to each specific race over the course of the timeline, right? I mean, according to sources like Zeldapedia, Zelda Dungeon, Hyrule Historia, one of the biggest race transitions is the Rudo evolving over time into the Rito, which are the flying species that we see in the Wind Waker, as well as Breath of the Wild. I think that's the only two games that they're in. I could be wrong, let me know if I missed a game, but hey, I'm D-Rock with Zelda Theory. I appreciate you stopping by, and in today's video, let's have a conversation about how another race in the Zelda series, the Kokiri, which are introduced to us in Ocarina of Time, eventually became the Koraks that we know and love from Breath of the Wild. Let's do it. I'd like to dive into some lore on these two races in an attempt to give you some more context to my point, okay? As always, links to all sources used in this video are in the description box below. So let's get the obvious thing out of the way. The Kokiri are a race of children that stay children. They don't grow up and are introduced in The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Our beloved Kokiri live in the Kokiri forest under the watch of the Great Deku Tree, who is said to be their father. I think that's the best and easiest way to explain that, so I hope it made sense. Each Kokiri has his or her own fairy partner, except for, of course, Link at the beginning of Ocarina of Time, right? And in my opinion, I personally think Saria is one of the most notable members of the Kokiri race. She displays a massive role that is really hard not to consider her to be one of the best, right? I mean, she's not only Link's best friend, but also the Sage of the Forest. That's super cool to me. The Kokiri are also under the leadership of Mido, a rude and quite honestly right up there as the biggest douchebag in the Zelda series. Such a jealous fellow Mido is. Kind of reminds me of our boy Groose, right? Much like Groose with his love for Zelda in Skyward Sword, Mido has a thing for Saria. So I'm sure that's a contributing factor as far as the reason why Mido is just so jealous of Link. Now, in addition to that, the Kokiri praise and sing Kumbaya to the massive tree in the forest, which we touched on a little bit earlier as the Great Deku Tree. And I guess you could, in a way, consider the Great Deku Tree their god or their deity. A pretty interesting concept, at least to me, is that the Kokiri also believe that they will die if they leave the forest. Now, if I remember correctly, the game sort of touches on the reasons behind this, but honestly, it was only for a brief moment. And definitely, if you know why, leave a comment below because I'm actually quite curious. The Kokiri also play a huge role in the plot of The Wind Waker as well, and by Kokiri, I mean one of them, because Fidel is one of the only Kokiri mentioned in the game with the responsibility of being the heir to the Sage of Winds and helping the King of Hyrule protect the power of the Master Sword. It's super dope, right? Now let's get into those nasty little boogers called the Koraks. The Koraks are a race that we know and love, or hate, most notably from Breath of the Wild because of trying to collect all 900 of these bad boys, or them playing a huge role in the story of the Wind Waker. The Koraks are said to be the descendants of the Kokiri. This is something that has been talked about heavily in the Zelda community. They are under the protection of the Great Deku Tree, much like in Ocarina of Time. And once a year, this is pretty cool, the Koraks partake in the Seed Giving Festival. The Koraks dance and sing to music played by Maker on a leaf-shaped violin. The Great Deku Tree then sprouts seeds, which each Korak takes and then plants the seeds throughout the Great Sea. The Koraks are light enough that they can use the Deku leaves to fly. This is explained in so much more detail in The Wind Waker, and if you haven't had a chance to play The Wind Waker, it's a gem, my friend, and I definitely recommend the adventure. The Great Deku Tree often refers to these little guys as his children. This is a very similar relationship to that of which the old Great Deku Tree had with the Kokiri in Ocarina of Time. I'd like to point out here that now the Koraks are allowed to leave the Forest Haven, whereas they were never allowed to leave the Kokiri Forest in their human counterparts, the Kokiri. They are, however, told to stay away from the Forbidden Woods at all costs, and I'm willing to bet it's because of its infestation with dangerous monsters, but what do I know? So now that we have a bit of context to these two races, let's talk about how, over the course of time, these two races became one entity, and what I mean is how the Kokiri came to be the little guys we just covered, the Koraks. Yes, the problem child is yet again Ocarina of Time. Of course. Let me explain. Ocarina of Time caused the timeline to split into 3 branches, right? And if you watched last week's video, hopefully that video cleared up the timelines for you. The events of one branch, the adult timeline, had massive ramifications, not just for Hyrule's geography, but for the citizens or races of this amazing location. In this timeline, the water-bound Zora evolved into the race that we know and love called the Rito. And again, that's a whole nother video topic that I'd like to do in the future, but for the sake of this video, let's just stick to the Koraks and the Kokiri, alright? Now, it is said that over the course of the Zelda timeline that the Kokiri themselves evolved from Hylians, one of the first races ever created, sometime after the creation of the Hyrule and during the era of prosperity. Now, for those of you that are curious, I mean, I know to me personally, this was very interesting to me as a fan. The era of prosperity is the historical era in which Hyrule was established. Chronologically speaking, it takes place after Skyward Sword and before the Minish Cap. This era then is after the era of Chaos, which the era of Chaos being the era that begins several years after the events of Skyward Sword and covers the ceiling of the Sacred Realm. During this time, the city began developing and industrializing to try and keep up with modern society. However, a small group of Hylians preferred nature to the growing city, and they moved from Hyrule to its nearby forest. These Hylians become the Kokiri, with their childlike appearances and their individual characteristics. The Kokiri keep to themselves in the forest, and they don't really interact much with Hylians or anyone else for that matter. I think a lot of us can relate to these guys, right? I don't know about you, but I'm definitely classified as an introvert. I know, doesn't sound like it, huh? The forest in which the Kokiri live come to be known as the Kokiri Forest. The guardian deity of the forest, we talked about this a little bit earlier, is the Great Deku Tree, who also protects one of the 3 spiritual stones. At the outset of Ocarina of Time, a Hylian child named Link is being hidden and kept safe by the Kokiri and the Deku Tree. Eventually, Ganondorf asks the Deku Tree to hand over the spiritual stone. The tree refuses, and Ganondorf places a curse on the Deku Tree, which, if you played the game, eventually, the curse kills him. The tree's death results in Kokiri Forest becoming overrun by monsters. What happens to the Kokiri next is absolutely insane, man. I'm specifically referring to the 3 splintered timelines. In the Fallen Hero timeline and Adult Zelda timeline, Link helps the Kokiri Saria awaken as a sage, which causes a new Deku Tree sprout to take root, right? Pretty epic cutscene, if I do say so myself. And then in the child era, Ganondorf is apprehended before his schemes can begin, which likely includes his curse on the Deku Tree. Now, no Zelda game on either the Child or Fallen Hero timelines ever mention the Kokiri or the Great Deku Tree again. Even though Hyrule goes into a dramatic decline in the Fallen Hero timeline, hopefully the lack of mention means the Kokiri are able to maintain their quiet lives, just removed from society in a way. The adult timeline is an entirely different story. The adult timeline is the one in which Link defeats Ganondorf and Zelda seals him away in the Sacred Realm. Zelda sends Link back in time to properly live out his childhood, which creates the era without a hero. The Kokiri keep their representation among the sages, who are now responsible for maintaining the Master Sword's power to repel evil. Now, to do this, the sages play a song to the gods while the king conducts them with the Wind Waker. Ganondorf creeps out of the seal, yet no one comes to rescue Hyrule. Desperate for help, the citizens pray to the 3 goddesses, and if you didn't know, the goddesses, they are Din, Nehru, and Feror. The goddesses instruct them to flee to the mountaintops and proceed to flood Hyrule, sealing Ganondorf at the bottom of the Great New Sea. Before the Great Flood, the current Kokiri Wind Sage, Fidel, had been inside the Wind Temple, where he remained for hundreds of years praying to retain the power of the Master Sword. The rest of the Kokiri found themselves in an entirely new environment, a vast, hostile sea dotted with occasional islands. Over time, the Kokiri evolved in order to fly over the Great Sea. The final form of their evolution were the Koraks, who maintained the Kokiri's childish nature. It's pretty cool. Koraks can fly using Deku leaves as propellers, which sprout from their own bodies. The Kokiri Forest becomes the island of Forest Haven, where the Koraks and Deku Tree continue to live. Using the power of flight, Koraks adopt the important job of spreading seeds, kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, across the islands of the Great Sea, aiding the growth of new forests. Now there's still one Kokiri left, Fido, who remains praying in the Wind Temple. How Fido is still alive after hundreds of years is canonically unaddressed, though perhaps being very involved in prayer while a sage in the Zelda universe expands one's lifetime. Unfortunately, when Ganon breaks out of the goddess's seal hundreds and hundreds of years later, the first thing he does is kill Fido. The spirit of the last Kokiri then waits in the Wind Temple for his successor. Link eventually finds Fido's spirit and brings the Korok maker to replace him, setting Fido's spirit free and completing the transition from the Kokiri to the Koroks. Now the next time the Koraks show up is in Breath of the Wild, which takes place thousands of years after Wind Waker's Link and Zelda go off to find the new Hyrule. Koraks now live in the Korok Forest, which is at the heart of the labyrinth enchanted Lost Woods. They've also evolved so that the vast majority of people either just don't see them at all, or believe them to just be trees. This explains why Koraks reveal themselves in playing hide and seek with Link for Korok seeds, and it's like a little game for them. Makes sense, right? How these Koraks came to be in the Korok Forest remains unanswered, unfortunately. Breath of the Wild's placement on the timeline is heavily debated, with many theories holding it so far in the future that the game unifies all of the three branches that we've covered in the last couple weeks of videos. The events leading to Saria awakening as a sage do not happen in the child timeline, which includes a game suspected to contribute lore to Breath of the Wild 2 Twilight Princess. Another cool theory floating around in the Zelda community, it seems to be up for grabs on whether the absence of a Kokiri sage would affect the development of the Koraks. The fate of the Kokiri in the child and fallen hero timelines is one of the many mysteries of the Legend of Zelda franchise. It's entirely possible that the Kokiri end up as the Koraks on all timelines for many different reasons, which is super cool because it gives the community endless opportunities to theorize and have amazing conversations, much like the one we are having right now. You are freaking amazing, and you have no idea how much I appreciate you, man. If you found value here today, give this video a like, subscribe, turn on all notifications, hit the bell, you know what to do, and hey, listen, click here so we can nerd out on some more Zelda and hang out until the end of time. Let's talk soon. Much peace and love.